Why shouldn't I adopt her instead? Dr. Lucinda Vale said, her voice carrying across the pediatric gala floor. A child like that deserves an opportunity, not a father tightening bolts in the ceiling. A few donors laughed under the soft chandelier light. Waiters paused. Cameras from the hospital charity stream tilted toward the maintenance ladder, where a man in worn boots stood frozen above them. Someone near the bar murmured that the foundation director had a point. After all, she funded half the wing. And the quiet worker fixing the wiring above the pediatric monitors looked like he belonged anywhere except the center of a wealthy adoption conversation. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. The strange thing was that the man on the ladder didn't argue. He didn't climb down in anger. Instead, he looked past the donors, past the glittering glasses, straight at the monitors on the far wall. His eyes moved the way a specialist studies numbers that others barely notice. A nurse standing nearby felt an odd chill. Because something about the maintenance worker's calm felt less like embarrassment and more like patience. What no one in that crowded hospital gala understood yet was simple. They weren't watching a powerless father being humiliated. They were watching a man who had already survived losing everything. And before the night ended, the same people laughing under the chandeliers would witness the exact moment the maintenance worker did something none of their celebrated doctors could. Silence settled around the ladder as the man climbed down carefully. Caleb Rowan landed softly on the polished floor, wiping his hands on an oil-stained cloth. 7 years of single fatherhood had carved patience into his bones. Arguments wasted energy. Protecting Mila never did. Across the room, his daughter sat cross-legged in the pediatric play corner, surrounded by bright plastic blocks donated by the same foundation, now discussing her future like a business investment. She didn't hear the comment. She was busy building a crooked castle and humming to herself. That small sound anchored him. Always had. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and expensive perfume tonight. Donors in tailored suits wandered through the ward pretending the charity event wasn't also a networking party. Crystal glasses clinked beside incubators. Soft jazz drifted through the hall. And right in the center of it all stood the woman who believed she could replace him. Lucinda Vale looked every inch the authority she was. Sharp suit. Diamond watch, the kind of posture that told a room she expected obedience before she even spoke. She didn't see cruelty in her suggestion. To her, it was generosity. A better school, a bigger house, a future funded by her foundation. From where she stood, adopting Mila probably looked like saving her. Caleb knew that look. He had seen it in boardrooms years ago when wealthy men discussed lives the way surgeons discussed charts. Numbers first, human cost later. Your wiring repair can wait, one administrator muttered quietly to him as guests began whispering again. Just stay out of the director's way tonight, he nodded once. Not submissive, just controlled. The ladder was folded and rolled toward the maintenance corridor. Metal wheels rattled softly against tile. Behind him, the conversation continued. Lucinda's voice carried again, lighter now. She's bright, the director said, glancing toward the play area. Imagine what proper resources could do. Several donors nodded thoughtfully. No one asked the father standing 10 feet away. He kept walking. The maintenance hallway greeted him with cooler air and the steady mechanical hum of hospital systems. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Pipes rattled somewhere in the ceiling. This was the part of the hospital power never noticed, the place where alarms were silenced before executives ever heard them. He preferred it here. Less pretending. A monitor inside the service panel flickered. He opened it automatically. Numbers streamed across the screen, pressure levels, oxygen backups, electrical loads tied to the pediatric intensive care grid. His hands moved without hesitation. Loose connection. 2 seconds. Fixed. But his eyes lingered on another set of readings, heart rate telemetry from the wing's central system. Patterns most technicians ignored. Except he didn't ignore patterns, he studied them. Across the hall, laughter from the gala echoed faintly through the vents. For a moment he imagined Mila hearing Lucinda's words. The thought tightened something deep in his chest. No one was taking her. Not with lawyers, not with charity smiles, not with money. He closed the panel slowly. Somewhere in the pediatric ward a machine beeped twice, then stopped. A nurse's footsteps rushed past the hallway entrance. He looked up. The calm inside him sharpened instantly. Because the rhythm of that alarm wasn't random, and instincts he had buried years ago stirred awake. He stepped toward the corridor. The gala noise was fading. Something else was beginning. The alarm that had chirped twice moments earlier shrieked again. This time it didn't stop. The sound cut through the hospital wing like a blade, sharp and urgent, silencing the soft jazz drifting from the gala. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. For a heartbeat, the glittering charity event and the sterile hospital reality collided. Caleb stepped out of the maintenance corridor just as a nurse rushed past him. Her shoes squeaked on the polished floor. Pediatric Room 4. She shouted toward the nurse's station. "Get Dr. Soria, now." Donors glanced around uneasily as hospital staff suddenly moved with the speed of people who understood exactly what that alarm meant. Across the room, Mila looked up from her block castle. "Daddy?" "I'm here," he called gently. She smiled and went back to stacking blocks, trusting him the way only a child can. But Caleb's eyes were already on the monitors lining the pediatric wall. Numbers streamed across them in jagged patterns. Too fast, too erratic. A pattern most people saw as chaos. He didn't. Years of instinct whispered quietly inside his mind. Irregular tachycardia, oxygen drop, neurological response lagging by 3 seconds. His jaw tightened. That wasn't a random collapse, that was a cascade. Staff burst into the hallway outside Room 4. Dr. Emmett Soria, the hospital's celebrated pediatric surgeon, rushed in while nurses prepared emergency trays. Donors stepped back, murmuring nervously. Someone whispered that the boy inside was Lucinda Vale's nephew. The powerful foundation director pushed through the crowd, her confident posture cracking for the first time. "Jordan?" she called. No one answered. Only the frantic rhythm of medical equipment. Caleb leaned against the maintenance cart near the corridor entrance, watching the monitors instead of the door. The numbers shifted again. His mind calculated without permission. Blood pressure collapse in under 90 seconds. Respiratory delay. Possible arterial blockage triggered by... No, that didn't make sense. Unless a nurse burst back into the hallway. "We can't stabilize him," she said breathlessly. Soria's voice echoed from inside the room. "Get cardiology down here, now." Lucinda grabbed the nurse's arm. "What's happening to him?" "We're working on it, ma'am." The nurse rushed away. Around them, the donors who had come for cocktails and charity suddenly found themselves pressed against the walls of a real hospital emergency. The smell of antiseptic grew stronger. Machines beeped wildly. Caleb's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the maintenance cart. He didn't move. But his gaze never left the monitor mounted above the hallway. Because the rhythm there told a different story. The pattern repeated. Heart spike, oxygen drop, neurological delay, again. A cold certainty slid into place. Across the room, Lucinda noticed him standing calmly while everyone else rushed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Perhaps she expected panic. Perhaps she expected anger after what she had said earlier. Instead, she found him studying hospital data like a man reading a familiar language. "Why are you staring at that screen?" she demanded sharply. Caleb didn't look at her. "Because it's telling the truth," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" He finally turned. The director of the hospital foundation stood inches away, surrounded by anxious donors and frozen staff. Her authority still filled the room. But beneath it now trembled something else. Fear. Caleb's voice stayed calm. "Your nephew didn't collapse from heart failure." Lucinda frowned. "You're a maintenance worker." He nodded once. "Tonight, yes," inside the room, Soria shouted again. His pulse is crashing. Lucinda's face drained of color. "What are they doing in there?" she asked. Caleb glanced once more at the screen. "They're chasing the wrong problem." Her expression hardened immediately. "Excuse me?" "You asked earlier why someone like me should raise a child," he said quietly. "You assumed I didn't understand what her future needs." Lucinda crossed her arms defensively. "Because opportunity matters." "Yes," he said, "it does." Another alarm screamed inside the room. This one louder, longer. The hallway filled with the metallic smell of emergency oxygen tanks. Doctors pushed equipment past the stunned donors. Lucinda turned toward the door helplessly. "What's happening to him?" she whispered. Caleb exhaled slowly, because the pattern on the monitor had just confirmed his suspicion. It wasn't cardiac failure, it was neurological compression triggered by a rare vascular collapse, a condition almost no one recognized until it was too late. He had seen it once before, years ago, in an operating room thousands of miles away, and if he was right, they had less than 4 minutes. He pushed the maintenance cart aside. "Your nephew needs a decompression procedure," he said. Lucinda blinked at him. "You're guessing?" "No." Another scream from the room. Flatline tone beginning to stretch longer between beats. Caleb stepped toward the door. "I'm remembering." Lucinda stared at him, confusion battling desperation. Behind her, donors whispered. Doctors inside the room were losing control of the situation. And for the first time that night, the woman who believed money solved everything realized she had no power over the clock now ticking in the pediatric wing. Before we go further into what happens next, subscribe to the channel if you believe the quietest people in the room sometimes hold the answers no one expects. Because what happened in that hallway next would force an entire hospital to rethink who they had just dismissed. The flatline tone inside pediatric room 4 stretched longer. Then it broke. Then stretched again. Lucinda Vale felt every second like a physical blow. Doctors moved frantically inside the room, their voices rising in tight bursts of urgency. Equipment clattered. A crash cart rolled across the tile. Someone shouted for cardiology again. But the rhythm of panic had replaced the rhythm of certainty. Caleb stood outside the doorway, still, watching. Another monitor beeped above the hall, flashing red warnings across the telemetry display. The pattern hadn't changed, which meant the doctors inside were still fighting the wrong battle. Lucinda turned toward him again, desperation sharpening her voice. "You said they're treating the wrong problem," she demanded. "Explain that." He didn't answer immediately, because through the open doorway he could now see Jordan Vale lying on the hospital bed. The boy's small chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths. Machines surrounded him. Doctors too. But none of them looked confident. Dr. Emmett Soria stood at the center of the chaos, sweat beading along his forehead while he examined test readings flashing across a tablet. Heart rhythm unstable, Soria muttered. Possible arrhythmia cascade. "No," Caleb said quietly. The word slipped out before he could stop it. Soria looked up sharply. Every head in the room turned toward the maintenance worker standing at the doorway. Lucinda stiffened beside him. The surgeon's eyes narrowed. "You're not staff," Soria said flatly. Caleb stepped closer to the threshold. "Neurological compression," he said calmly. The room went silent for half a second. Then a nurse shook her head. "There's no evidence of—" "There will be," he interrupted softly. Soria folded his arms. "You've been watching monitors from the hallway and now you're diagnosing a patient?" Caleb didn't react to the sarcasm. He kept his eyes on the boy. "Heart spike followed by oxygen delay," he said. 3-second neurological lag each cycle. Soria frowned. That could still indicate an arterial collapse pressing against the vagus nerve. Caleb finished. The surgeon paused, only for a moment. But it was enough, because the monitors behind him beeped again. Spike, drop, delay. Exactly as Caleb had described. Lucinda saw Soria glance back at the screen, saw the flicker of doubt that crossed his face. "What is he talking about?" she demanded. Soria exhaled slowly. "It's unlikely, but possible?" she pressed. He hesitated. "Yes." Caleb leaned against the doorframe, voice steady. "If that pressure reaches the brainstem, the heart rhythm will collapse completely." The nurse beside the bed checked the monitor again. Pulse dropping. Soria snapped back into action. Prep for arterial imaging. 2 nurses rushed to comply. But Caleb shook his head slightly. "You don't have time for imaging." Soria's patient snapped. "And you know this because—" For the first time since the alarms began, Caleb looked directly at him. Because he had performed that exact procedure once before. In a military trauma tent where electricity flickered and helicopters roared overhead. But none of that belonged in this hallway tonight. "Not yet, because the collapse cycle is accelerating," he said instead. Another monitor screamed. The pulse reading dipped dangerously low. Lucinda gripped the back of a chair near the wall. "Do something," she whispered. The powerful foundation director who had commanded boardrooms and donors all evening suddenly looked like any other terrified aunt. Soria barked orders. "Prepare emergency intubation." Nurses moved quickly, but Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on the boy's neck. A subtle tension there, barely visible. Most people would miss it. But he had trained himself never to miss small signs. Jordan's chest jerked again, pulse crashing, flatline nearly forming. Caleb exhaled slowly. This was the moment. The narrow line between observation and intervention. The moment when knowledge demanded action. He stepped into the room. Soria immediately blocked him. "You're done," the surgeon said sharply. "Maintenance needs to stay outside." Caleb met his gaze calmly. "If you intubate him now, you'll compress the artery further." The surgeon hesitated. Another alarm shrieked. Pulse 42. Lucinda's voice trembled. "Doctor." Soria clenched his jaw. The monitors beeped again. Spike, drop, delay. Exactly the same pattern, exactly the same timing. And suddenly the confident surgeon realized something uncomfortable. The maintenance worker's prediction kept matching the data. Soria turned slowly toward him. "How would you decompress it?" he asked. Caleb answered without hesitation. Manual subclavian release followed by microvascular clamp. The room froze, because that wasn't something a technician guessed. That was a surgical instruction. A very specific one. Soria stared at him. "Where did you learn that?" Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the boy. Jordan's pulse dropped again. 39. Lucinda stepped closer, her voice breaking. "If you know how to help him, please." For the first time that night, the woman who had offered to adopt his daughter wasn't speaking from authority. She was speaking from fear. Caleb moved toward the bed. Soria didn't stop him this time. Because the monitors were telling the same story Caleb had been reading all along, and the truth none of them wanted to admit was becoming impossible to ignore. The quiet maintenance worker standing beside the bed understood the crisis better than anyone else in the room. And in less than 3 minutes, everyone in that hospital would find out why. The monitor beside the bed screamed again. Jordan's pulse dipped lower, the number flickering like a dying signal. Nurses moved faster now, their calm professionalism cracking under the pressure of a crisis that refused to follow their expectations. Caleb stood beside the bed, studying the boy's neck. Every instinct he had buried for 7 years was awake again. Soria watched him carefully, arms crossed but no longer blocking the path. The surgeon's confidence had shifted into cautious curiosity. "You're saying the artery's compressed," Soria said slowly. Caleb nodded. "Subclavian branch," he replied. "Pressure's riding the vagus nerve every cycle." Another alarm blared. Pulse 38. Lucinda's breath caught. "What happens if it keeps dropping?" she asked. Soria didn't answer immediately. Because they both knew the truth. Caleb answered instead. "Cardiac arrest," the word hung in the room like a weight. Lucinda's face paled. A moment ago she had been discussing adoption strategies over champagne. Now she was watching a clock count down her nephew's life. Soria stepped closer to the monitor, eyes narrowing as the rhythm repeated again. Spike, drop, delay. Exactly the pattern Caleb had described. "How long?" Soria asked quietly. Caleb glanced at the boy's chest. 2 minutes before the nerve shuts the heart down completely. A nurse whispered under her breath. "That's impossible." But the monitor didn't argue. 36. Lucinda grabbed the edge of the bed rail. "Do something," she pleaded. The room went silent. Soria looked at Caleb. "You said manual release first," the surgeon said carefully. "Then clamp." Caleb nodded once. Soria studied him for another second. Then something remarkable happened. The hospital's most celebrated pediatric surgeon stepped aside. "Show me," he said. A murmur rippled through the staff, because no surgeon handed control to a maintenance worker, not unless the alternative was worse. Caleb moved forward. His hands were steady, too steady. He gently tilted Jordan's head to the side, fingers pressing carefully along the boy's collarbone. "Pulse monitor," he said calmly. A nurse read the numbers, 35. Caleb adjusted his grip slightly. Now, the nurse's eyes widened. 39, 42, Soria leaned closer. "What did you just do?" "Relieved the pressure," Caleb replied. But his voice carried something deeper than explanation. It carried memory. His fingers remained exactly where they needed to be. But everyone in the room could see the strain building in his arms. Holding that position required precision. And strength. "How long can you maintain it?" Soria asked. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Not long." Soria turned immediately to the nurses. "Prep microvascular clamp." Equipment trays clattered as instruments were rushed into position. The rhythm of the room had changed, panic replaced by focused urgency. But Lucinda wasn't watching the equipment. She was watching the man holding her nephew's life steady with 2 fingers. "You're not a maintenance worker," she said quietly. Caleb didn't look at her. "I fix things, that's not what this is." His hands never moved. "No," he agreed softly. Across the room, the monitor climbed again. 45, 48, stabilizing. The staff exchanged glances of disbelief. Soria leaned closer to the boy's shoulder, examining Caleb's hand placement. "You've done this before," the surgeon said. It wasn't a question. Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he spoke to the nurse beside him. "When the clamp goes in, pressure releases here first," he said. "If you wait even half a second, the artery collapses again." The nurse nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." The word slipped out automatically. Soria noticed it. So did Lucinda. Because people didn't accidentally call technicians sir during surgery. Another tray arrived. Soria picked up the clamp, examining it under the bright surgical lights. "Everyone step back," he ordered. Donors watching from the hallway leaned forward anxiously. Word had already begun spreading through the gala crowd. Something extraordinary was happening inside the pediatric ward. Inside the room, Soria positioned himself beside Caleb. "On your count," the surgeon said. Caleb glanced at the monitor. Pulse, 50. Better, but still fragile. 3 seconds after release, he said. Soria nodded. The clamp hovered above the incision point. Lucinda held her breath. "Ready," Soria said. Caleb looked once more at the numbers flashing across the screen. Then he spoke calmly. 3, the room stilled. 2, the monitor beeped again. Now, Caleb lifted his fingers. Soria moved instantly. The clamp snapped into place. For half a second, the monitor flatlined. Lucinda gasped. Then, beep. Pulse, 52. Another beep. 58. The room exploded with relieved movement. Nurses checked readings. Oxygen stabilized. The chaotic alarms faded into steady, rhythmic signals. Jordan's chest rose normally again. Lucinda sank against the wall, tears filling her eyes. "He's alive?" she whispered. Soria checked the monitor again, then nodded slowly. "He's stable." The staff exhaled collectively. But Soria wasn't celebrating yet. He was staring at Caleb. Because the calm precision he had just witnessed belonged to someone who had spent years in operating rooms, not maintenance corridors. "You want to explain something to me?" Soria asked. Caleb stepped back from the bed. His arms finally relaxed. 7 years of silence pressed behind his eyes. But the truth was already visible in the room. Lucinda spoke first. Her voice quiet now. "Who are you?" Caleb wiped his hands on the maintenance cloth still tucked into his belt, the same cloth he had used earlier to clean grease from hospital wiring. He glanced once toward the hallway, where Mila still sat building her crooked block castle, unaware that her father had just saved a life. Then he looked back at the room. "I used to work in trauma surgery," he said. Silence followed. Soria blinked. "Used to?" Caleb nodded. "Before I had someone more important to take care of," Lucinda stared at him, because the man she had offered to replace as a father had just done something none of her hospital's celebrated specialists had managed, and the realization hit her all at once. The quiet single dad she had dismissed was the most capable doctor in the entire building. For a moment after the clamp clicked into place, the entire pediatric room held its breath. Then the monitor settled into a steady rhythm. Beep, beep. The sound was simple, ordinary. But in that room it felt like thunder rolling through silence. A nurse wiped sweat from her forehead. Another adjusted Jordan's oxygen mask with trembling hands. Dr. Soria stepped back slowly, still staring at the numbers climbing across the screen. 61. 64. Stabilizing. "He's responding," the nurse whispered. Lucinda Vale covered her mouth as relief crashed over her. Her knees nearly buckled before she caught herself against the counter. 7 minutes earlier she had been debating adoption futures in a room full of donors. Now she was watching a maintenance worker bring her nephew back from the edge of death. And nothing about that sentence made sense anymore. Across the room, Caleb stepped away from the bed. His hands felt strangely heavy. Muscle memory still lingered in his fingers. The exact pressure points, the angle of release, the timing of the clamp. The kind of movements the body remembers long after the mind tries to forget. 7 years. 7 years since he had stood in a surgical emergency like this. 7 years since he promised himself he wouldn't. He glanced toward the hallway. Through the glass window he could still see Mila sitting in the play corner. Her crooked block castle had grown taller, the plastic towers leaning dangerously as she hummed softly to herself. She looked safe. That mattered more than anything. Vitals holding, a nurse reported. Soria finally exhaled and removed his gloves. When he turned back toward Caleb, the confidence in his posture had changed. It wasn't authority anymore. It was respect mixed with confusion. "You said you used to work trauma surgery," Soria said carefully. Caleb nodded. "Army Medical Division," he replied quietly. The words moved through the room like a ripple. Several nurses exchanged surprised looks. Lucinda stared at him as though seeing him for the first time. "Army?" she repeated. He leaned lightly against the counter, exhaustion creeping into his shoulders now that the crisis had passed. "Field trauma surgeon," he said. Soria blinked. "That procedure you just performed, that's not standard civilian training." "No," Caleb agreed. "It isn't." The surgeon folded his arms again, studying him with new interest. "How many years?" Caleb thought about it for a moment. 12. One of the nurses gasped softly. Lucinda's voice came out almost as a whisper. "And now you fix hospital wiring?" Caleb shrugged slightly. "Someone has to." The answer was so simple, it almost felt like a refusal to explain further. But Lucinda wasn't finished. She walked slowly toward him, the earlier authority in her stride replaced by uncertainty. "You saved my nephew," she said. He nodded once. "Yes. And you've been working here? In maintenance?" "Yes." Lucinda glanced toward the hallway where donors still gathered nervously, whispering about what had happened. Some were already filming quietly with their phones. Word traveled fast in rooms full of wealthy people. She looked back at him. Why? The question carried layers. Why hide? Why leave medicine? Why raise a child alone in a job that barely paid enough to survive? Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the pediatric play area again. Mila had knocked over one side of her block castle and was laughing softly as she rebuilt it. "Because priorities change," he said finally. Lucinda followed his gaze. For the first time that night, she truly looked at the child, the same child she had discussed adopting earlier, the same child whose father she had publicly judged. The realization landed heavily. "You left surgery for her," she said quietly. He nodded. "My wife died in an operating room," he said. The words were simple. But the room went silent again. Soria lowered his eyes slightly. Lucinda felt a knot form in her chest, and after that, she said carefully. Caleb finished the thought. "I wasn't interested in hospitals anymore." Another monitor beeped steadily beside Jordan's bed. Alive. Lucinda looked back at the boy. Then at the man who had saved him. The same man she had humiliated in front of donors. Her voice softened. "I didn't know." Caleb shrugged. "You didn't ask." That line landed harder than anything else spoken that night. Outside the room, more hospital staff were gathering. Word had spread through the building now. Maintenance worker saves board director's nephew. The story sounded unbelievable, yet the steady monitor behind them told the truth. Lucinda turned toward the door slowly. Her foundation board members were waiting in the hallway. Donors, too. All the same people who had heard her suggest Mila deserved a better father. She suddenly understood something uncomfortable. Every one of them had witnessed the first half of the story. Now they were about to witness the second. Before we continue, if stories like this remind you that real strength often hides in the quietest people, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because the moment waiting outside that hospital room was about to change everything those donors believed about power. The hallway outside Pediatric Room 4 had transformed. Minutes earlier, it had been a polished charity corridor, soft music, champagne glasses, donors discussing philanthropy beneath warm chandelier light. Now it looked like the aftermath of a storm. Hospital staff crowded the walls. Nurses whispered urgently. Security tried to gently move guests back while cameras from the charity livestream continued recording everything unfolding inside the wing. The moment Caleb stepped through the door, every conversation stopped. Word had traveled faster than anyone expected. A maintenance worker saves the foundation director's nephew. Donors stared, some with curiosity, some with disbelief. Lucinda followed a few steps behind him, still shaken, her polished authority replaced by the fragile posture of someone who had just watched a life nearly disappear. Dr. Soria emerged next, removing his gloves slowly. "He's stable," the surgeon announced. The tension in the hallway broke instantly. A wave of relieved murmurs swept through the crowd. "Oh, thank God." "Jordan's okay. I told you this hospital had the best doctors." But Soria raised a hand. "Correction," he said calmly. His eyes moved to Caleb. That man stabilized him. The hallway froze again. Several donors turned toward the quiet figure standing beside the maintenance cart. The oil-stained cloth still hung from his belt. Work boots scuffed the hospital floor. Nothing about him looked like a surgeon. Lucinda felt dozens of eyes shift toward her, because every person in that hallway had heard her earlier comment. "Why shouldn't I adopt her instead?" She swallowed. A foundation director rarely lost control of a room, but this one had slipped away from her completely. Soria stepped closer to Caleb. "You said Army trauma surgeon," he said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Yes. How long since you last operated?" Caleb thought about the answer. 7 years. A nurse near the back gasped softly. 7 years away from medicine, yet he had just performed a life-saving intervention faster than the hospital's top specialists. Soria shook his head in disbelief. "That's impossible." Caleb shrugged lightly. Muscle memory. Lucinda studied him carefully now. Every movement he made felt different than it had earlier that evening. Before, she had seen a maintenance worker avoiding eye contact. Now she saw someone who carried the quiet posture of a man used to responsibility, used to life or death decisions. "You read the monitors from the hallway," she said slowly. "Yes, and you knew what was happening before our doctors did, yes." Her voice softened. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Caleb's gaze moved toward the play corner again. Mila was now standing, holding one of her plastic blocks like a tiny crown. She waved when she saw him looking. He lifted a hand back. Then he turned toward Lucinda again. "Because doctors usually don't like maintenance staff diagnosing patients," he said calmly. A few people in the hallway chuckled nervously. Soria rubbed the back of his neck. "That's fair." Lucinda exhaled slowly. Embarrassment crept into her voice now. "Earlier tonight I suggested your daughter deserved better opportunities." Caleb said nothing, which somehow made the moment heavier. "I thought you were just surviving," she continued. "I am," he said. Lucinda frowned. "That's not what I meant. I know." The hallway fell quiet again, because survival suddenly looked very different when the man doing it had once been saving lives in combat hospitals. Soria crossed his arms thoughtfully. "You ever consider coming back to surgery?" he asked. Caleb didn't hesitate. "No. Why?" Caleb looked again at Mila. She had returned to rebuilding her block castle. One of the towers leaned crookedly, but she kept working patiently. Because that's what kids did. They built things, even when pieces fell. She needed a father more than the world needed another surgeon, he said simply. Lucinda felt something tighten painfully in her chest, because she remembered exactly what she had said earlier. A child like that deserves opportunity. The words now sounded arrogant in her own memory, and cruel. She stepped closer. "Caleb," she said quietly. It was the first time she had used his name. He looked at her. "I owe you an apology." He waited. Lucinda took a breath. "I judged you tonight," she said, publicly, without knowing anything about your life. The donors around them listened carefully. No one interrupted, because the balance of power in that hallway had shifted completely. Caleb studied her for a moment. Then he shrugged slightly. "You were worried about a kid," he said. "Yes, same here." Lucinda's voice softened. "You didn't even hesitate to save him." Caleb glanced toward the pediatric room door. The steady beep of the monitor still echoed faintly inside. "No parent should lose a child," he said quietly. The sentence landed with quiet gravity. Because suddenly everyone understood something important. This man hadn't saved Jordan because of forgiveness, or because of pride. He had saved him because he understood exactly what losing a child meant. Lucinda lowered her gaze briefly, then she looked up again. "I was wrong about you." Caleb shook his head gently. "You were wrong about maintenance workers," he corrected. Several nurses smiled at that. Lucinda almost did too. Then the doors behind them opened again. Another doctor stepped into the hallway with fresh reports. "Jordan's fully stabilized," he announced. Applause broke out among the donors. But many of them weren't looking at the doctors anymore. They were looking at the quiet single father standing beside a maintenance cart. Because they had just witnessed something extraordinary, and the story of the night was only beginning to spread. The applause faded slowly, but the attention in the hallway didn't. If anything, it grew heavier. Dozens of eyes followed the quiet single dad standing beside the maintenance cart. Some of the donors who had laughed earlier now shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered behind raised glasses, trying to piece together the story spreading through the pediatric wing. The maintenance worker saves the board director's nephew. Army trauma surgeon. 7 years away from medicine. The story sounded impossible, but the steady beep from the hospital room behind them kept confirming it. Caleb didn't seem interested in the attention. He pushed the maintenance cart toward the service hallway again, the small metal wheels rattling across the tile. The motion looked so ordinary that several donors blinked in confusion. The man who had just stabilized a life-threatening vascular collapse was returning to fix electrical panels. Lucinda noticed. "Wait," she called. He stopped. The hallway quieted again as she walked toward him. Earlier that night she had crossed the room with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention. Now her steps felt slower, more careful. Because the power dynamic between them had shifted in ways she didn't fully understand yet. "You're going back to work?" she asked. Caleb nodded once. "Something wrong with the backup line in pediatric telemetry," he said. Soria blinked. "You just performed an emergency intervention." Caleb shrugged. "Didn't finish my shift." A few nurses exchanged amused glances. Lucinda studied him again. 7 years of quiet responsibility showed in the lines around his eyes. The posture of someone who had learned to carry heavy things without complaining. "You're serious," she said. "Yes." The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than anything else tonight, because people who saved lives usually expected recognition, praise, maybe even applause. This man just wanted to fix a wire. Lucinda followed his gaze down the hallway. Mila was still building her crooked block castle, now adding a plastic dinosaur guard beside the tallest tower. She looked up again and waved. "Daddy." Her voice carried easily across the wing. Caleb smiled faintly. "I'll be right there," he called. Then he turned back toward Lucinda. "She gets nervous in hospitals if I disappear too long." Lucinda felt a small ache in her chest, because suddenly she understood something she had missed earlier. The quiet patience. The maintenance job. The way he never left the pediatric wing during his shifts. He hadn't chosen this job because it was easy. He had chosen it because it kept him close to his daughter. Soria stepped closer, curiosity still written across his face. "You really walked away from surgery?" the doctor asked. Yes. Just like that? Caleb thought about the question. It wasn't just like that. The hallway waited. Even the donors stopped whispering. My wife died during a complicated procedure, he said quietly. Post-operative hemorrhage we couldn't stop. Lucinda's shoulders lowered slightly. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded once. She was a surgeon, too. The revelation surprised several nurses. Surya tilted his head. You both worked trauma? Yes, the surgeon considered that for a moment. That must have been intense. Caleb smiled faintly. It was. Lucinda looked toward Mila again, and after that? I had a 6-month-old daughter, he said. The explanation was simple, but it carried the weight of an entire life decision. The donors listening nearby shifted again, their earlier assumptions dissolving piece by piece. Because suddenly the quiet maintenance worker wasn't a man who lacked opportunity. He was a man who had sacrificed it. Lucinda spoke carefully now. I said earlier that your daughter deserved more opportunity. Caleb didn't answer, so she continued. I assumed you couldn't provide it. He looked at her calmly. She's healthy, he said. Lucinda nodded. Yes, she's safe. Yes, she laughs every day. Lucinda's voice softened. Yes, Caleb shrugged lightly. That sounds like opportunity to me. The sentence hung in the hallway like a quiet verdict. Several nurses smiled. Surya looked down thoughtfully, and Lucinda felt the weight of her earlier arrogance settle fully on her shoulders. Because she suddenly realized something uncomfortable. She had measured fatherhood with money, while the man standing in front of her had measured it with presence. Behind them, the pediatric room door opened again. A nurse stepped out with a clipboard. Jordan's asking for his aunt, she said gently. Lucinda turned quickly. Relief flooded her face again. I'm coming. She walked toward the door, then paused, turning back. Caleb. He looked up. Thank you, she said. The words sounded different now, not polite, not formal, real. He nodded once. You're welcome. Then he pushed the maintenance cart down the service hallway again. The metal wheels rattled softly. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Behind him, the wealthy donors continued whispering about the miracle they had just witnessed. But ahead of him, Mila's small voice was already calling again. And that was the only audience he cared about. Mila spotted him the moment he stepped back into the pediatric play corner. Daddy, she said again, this time louder, dropping the plastic dinosaur guard and running toward him. He knelt just in time to catch her as she crashed into his arms. You fixed the lights? She asked seriously. He smiled faintly. Something like that. She studied his face the way children do when they know something important has happened but don't understand the details. You were gone a long time, I know. Behind them, the hallway still buzzed with whispers. Donors lingered near the doorway of room 4, trying to catch glimpses of the boy whose life had nearly ended. Hospital staff moved carefully through the crowd, restoring order after the emergency. But in the play corner, the world shrank to plastic blocks and a crooked castle. Mila tugged his sleeve. Look, she said proudly. He turned. The block tower leaned dangerously to one side, but she had added 2 extra walls around the base, so it won't fall again, she explained. Caleb nodded. Good engineering, she beamed. A few feet away, Lucinda stood watching them. The earlier tension in her shoulders had softened, but she hadn't left the hallway yet. The director of one of the largest hospital foundations in the region looked oddly hesitant now, like someone unsure how to enter a room she once commanded. Surya stood beside her. You're still thinking about what happened earlier, the surgeon said quietly. Lucinda nodded. Yes, you handled it well. She gave him a small, humorless smile. No, I didn't. Across the hall, a group of donors approached slowly. Their curiosity had grown stronger than their discomfort. One of them, a tall man in a charcoal suit, spoke first. "That was remarkable," he said, nodding toward Caleb. "I assume the hospital will be announcing his return to surgery?" Caleb heard the question, but kept helping Mila rebuild her castle. Lucinda answered instead. "That decision belongs to him." The donor blinked. "Well, surely someone with that level of training shouldn't be repairing wiring." Lucinda glanced at Caleb again. He looked perfectly content kneeling on the floor beside a 7-year-old architect. "You're measuring value by the wrong scale," she said quietly. The donor frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. Soria cleared his throat. Technically, the surgeon added, he just performed a life-saving procedure faster than any of us in the room. That ended the conversation. Across the play corner, Mila finished placing the last block on her castle. "Done," she announced. Caleb leaned back on his heels. "Look strong," she nodded proudly. "Because you showed me how to fix the bottom parts." He ruffled her hair gently. "That's the important part." Lucinda stepped closer now, approaching slowly so she wouldn't startle the child. Mila noticed her first. "Oh," the girl said, "you're the lady from before." Lucinda knelt slightly so they were eye level. "Yes, I am. You made everyone quiet earlier." The comment made a few nearby nurses smile. Lucinda nodded. "I did." Mila looked thoughtful. "Are you still mad at my dad?" The question hit the hallway like a sudden breeze. Lucinda hesitated. Because children asked things, adults danced around. "No," she said softly. "I'm not." Mila seemed satisfied with that answer. "Good," she said. Then she returned to adjusting the dinosaur guard beside the castle. Lucinda stood again. Her gaze moved to Caleb. "You said earlier that priorities change," she said. "Yes." "And you chose this life?" "Yes." Lucinda exhaled slowly. "I spent years building programs to give children better futures." Caleb listened quietly. "But tonight," she continued, "I realized something." He waited. Sometimes the future they need is already standing right beside them. The hallway fell silent again. Caleb didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up one of the fallen blocks and placed it gently beside Mila's castle. "Parents try," he said simply. Lucinda nodded, yes. Across the hall, Jordan's doctor stepped out again with another update. "He's awake," the doctor announced. Lucinda's breath caught. "Can I see him?" Of course, she started toward the room. But halfway there, she stopped, turning back once more. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "My foundation hosts a major board gathering every quarter." He waited. Lucinda continued carefully. "The next one is tomorrow afternoon." Caleb frowned slightly. "That's good. I'd like you to attend." The request surprised several donors nearby. Caleb blinked. "Why?" Lucinda met his gaze steadily. "Because some people in that room need to understand something important." He shook his head gently. "I'm not a speaker, I know. Then why me?" Lucinda gestured subtly toward Mila. "Because the story they heard tonight isn't finished yet." Caleb considered the request for a moment. The hallway lights hummed softly above them. Monitors beeped steadily inside Jordan's room. Finally, he shrugged. "I'll think about it." Lucinda smiled faintly. "That's all I'm asking." Before the story continues, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the moment when the same donors who judged his father face the truth tomorrow, because the quiet maintenance worker who saved a life tonight was about to walk into a room full of powerful people who still believed they understood what success looked like. The hallway gradually emptied as the night settled back into something resembling normal hospital rhythm. Donors began leaving in small groups, their earlier laughter replaced by thoughtful silence. Staff returned to their stations. The chaos that had erupted around Jordan's collapse slowly dissolved into the steady pulse of machines and quiet footsteps in long corridors. But the story of what had happened didn't fade. It spread. By the time Caleb walked Mila toward the hospital exit, several nurses were already whispering about the maintenance surgeon. Security guards nodded at him with new curiosity. Even the receptionist at the front desk glanced up from her computer with wide eyes. Mila noticed the looks immediately. "Why is everyone staring at you?" she asked, gripping his hand. He shrugged. "Maybe they like your castle-building skills," she laughed. "No, they don't. They're looking at you." He opened the glass door leading outside. Cool night air drifted in, carrying the faint scent of rain and city lights. "People stare sometimes," he said. She tilted her head. "Did you fix something big?" He thought about Jordan's small body lying under hospital lights. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." Outside, the hospital parking lot glowed beneath tall lamps. The charity event cars had mostly left, sleek black sedans and luxury SUVs disappearing into the city hours earlier. Caleb's old pickup truck sat alone near the edge of the lot. Mila climbed into the passenger seat while he tossed the maintenance bag into the back. But before he closed the door, a familiar voice called out behind him. "Wait." Lucinda crossed the parking lot quickly, coat pulled around her shoulders against the cool wind. For a moment, the powerful director of a multi-million-dollar foundation looked less like a leader and more like someone chasing an unfinished thought. He leaned against the truck door. "Everything okay with your nephew?" he asked. She nodded. "He's sleeping." Relief softened her face again. "Doctors say he'll make a full recovery." "Good." Lucinda studied him carefully. "You're leaving already?" "My shift ended an hour ago. And tomorrow?" He raised an eyebrow. "Tomorrow what?" "The board gathering," she said. Caleb sighed lightly. He had been hoping the conversation would end inside the hospital. Lucinda read the hesitation immediately. "You think this is about recognition," she said. He didn't answer. "It isn't," she continued. "Then what is it?" Lucinda gestured toward the hospital building behind them. "Those donors inside believe they understand hardship," she said. "They write checks to solve it." Caleb waited. "They think opportunity comes from money," she added. "And you disagree now?" She smiled faintly. Tonight proved something different. Wind rustled across the parking lot. Inside the truck, Mila leaned across the seat watching them curiously through the window. Lucinda lowered her voice slightly. "You don't have to give a speech," she said. "That's good," he replied. "But you should be in that room. Why?" Lucinda looked toward the hospital again. "Because they need to see what real sacrifice looks like." He shifted his weight against the truck. "I didn't sacrifice anything." She raised an eyebrow. "You left a career most doctors spend their lives chasing." He shrugged. "I chose my daughter. That sacrifice? No," he said calmly. "That's parenting." The simplicity of the answer made Lucinda smile despite herself. "You're stubborn. I've been called worse." She glanced toward Mila. The girl waved enthusiastically through the windshield. Lucinda waved back. "She's lucky," Lucinda said. Caleb followed her gaze. "She keeps me honest." Lucinda folded her arms thoughtfully. "You know what the donors said after you left the hallway?" "No. They asked how a hospital could allow someone with your training to work maintenance." He chuckled quietly. "That question tells you everything about them." "Yes," Lucinda agreed. "That's exactly why tomorrow matters." He studied her for a long moment. Lucinda Vale had spent years building power in rooms filled with influential people. Yet tonight that confidence had cracked open long enough for her to see something she had missed before. Finally he sighed. "What time?" Her smile widened slightly. 3 o'clock. He opened the truck door. I'll stop by after work. Lucinda nodded. That's all I hoped for. He climbed into the driver's seat. The engine rumbled to life. Lucinda stepped back as the truck rolled slowly toward the exit. Inside the cab, Mila looked up at him. Daddy? Yeah? Are we going back tomorrow? He glanced at her. Looks like it. She grinned. Good. Why? Because hospitals are exciting. He laughed softly. Only a child could say that after everything that had happened tonight. Behind them, the hospital lights glowed against the dark sky. Inside those walls, powerful donors were already discussing tomorrow's meeting. They believed it would be another routine foundation gathering. Another afternoon of charity speeches and financial pledges. What they didn't realize yet was that the quiet single dad they had dismissed earlier was about to walk into that room. And the truth they would hear there would change the way they measured success forever. The foundation boardroom looked exactly the way powerful people liked their rooms to look. Glass walls overlooking the city. A polished walnut table stretching the length of the floor, screens glowing softly with donation totals and foundation milestones. At 3 o'clock sharp, the room filled with donors. Executives adjusted cufflinks, advisors shuffled papers. A few members quietly discussed the emergency that had disrupted the charity gala the night before. Most of them had only heard fragments. Maintenance worker. Medical emergency. Director's nephew saved. But stories tend to shrink when they travel through wealthy rooms. By the time the whispers reached the board table, the details had blurred into something far less remarkable. Apparently, the staff handled it well, one board member said. Lucinda Vale sat at the head of the table, listening quietly. She didn't correct them yet. Because the door at the far end of the room had just opened. Caleb stepped inside. Work boots. Maintenance uniform. The same oil-stained cloth tucked into his pocket. The board members glanced up briefly, expecting a technician fixing equipment before the meeting began. One of them even gestured toward the ceiling lights. Those flicker sometimes, the man said casually. Lucinda spoke before Caleb could answer. He's not here for maintenance. That got their attention. The room shifted slightly. Chairs creaked. Eyes moved from Lucinda to the quiet father standing beside the doorway. This is Caleb, Lucinda said calmly. No last name, no introduction yet, just a name. Several donors frowned in confusion. Who exactly is Caleb? Another board member asked. Lucinda leaned back slightly in her chair. He's the man who saved my nephew's life last night. Silence filled the boardroom. Someone cleared their throat. A few members exchanged skeptical looks. You mean one of the doctors, a donor corrected. Lucinda shook her head. No. Her voice remained steady. He works maintenance in the pediatric wing. That statement landed like a stone in water. Ripples of disbelief moved through the room. That's not possible, one executive said. Another leaned forward. Are we sure about that? Lucinda gestured toward the empty chair beside her. Why don't we ask him? Caleb walked slowly toward the table. Every polished shoe in the room watched his boots cross the expensive floor. The contrast was impossible to ignore. He stopped beside the chair but didn't sit. Morning, he said calmly. A few board members blinked. It was afternoon. But no one corrected him. Lucinda folded her hands on the table. Would you mind explaining what happened in the pediatric wing? Caleb shrugged lightly. Kid collapsed. A few board members chuckled awkwardly at the simplicity. Lucinda didn't smile. And then? Doctors thought it was heart failure. And you disagreed? Yes. One of the older donors leaned forward. And what gave you the authority to challenge trained physicians? Caleb met his gaze calmly. Experience. The man frowned. What experience? The room waited. Lucinda didn't interrupt, because this moment mattered more than any speech she could give. Caleb rested his hands lightly on the back of the chair. "Army trauma surgeon," he said. The words settled across the room slowly. Several board members straightened in their seats. One executive blinked twice. "How long?" someone asked. 12 years. A murmur moved around the table. Another donor leaned back in disbelief. "And you're currently working maintenance?" "Yes." The executive who had mentioned the flickering lights earlier spoke again. "That seems like a waste of extraordinary skill," Caleb shrugged. "Depends what you measure." The boardroom grew quieter. Lucinda watched the shift happening around the table. These were people who believed success was defined by titles, investments, and influence. Now they were staring at a man who had walked away from all three. One donor spoke carefully. "If you had that level of training, why leave?" Caleb glanced toward the window overlooking the city. "My wife died in surgery," he said. The room stilled. She was a surgeon, too. A few board members lowered their eyes, and after that, someone asked quietly, "I had a daughter who needed a father." Lucinda watched the realization spread across the room. These donors had spent years discussing children's futures through scholarships and grants, yet none of them had expected the most powerful example of sacrifice to walk into their meeting wearing work boots. The executive who had questioned him earlier leaned forward again. "You gave up everything for her." Caleb shook his head. "I chose her." The correction changed the entire tone of the room, because sacrifice implied loss. Choice implied strength. Lucinda finally spoke again. "Last night," she said calmly, "I suggested that his daughter deserved a better life than the one he could provide." The board members looked at her. Then at Caleb. Then back again. Lucinda's voice softened slightly. "I was wrong." Silence followed. The wealthy donors sitting around that polished table understood something uncomfortable now. The man standing before them wasn't defined by what he lacked. He was defined by what he refused to abandon. And suddenly, the maintenance worker they barely noticed had become the most respected person in the room. The boardroom stayed silent long after Lucinda's words faded. No one shuffled papers anymore. No one checked their phones. The quiet single father standing beside the conference table had shifted the gravity of the entire room. For years, those donors had built their influence through numbers, donation totals, investment portfolios, foundation expansions. But the story they had just heard didn't fit into any of those categories. Lucinda folded her hands calmly on the table, watching the realization spread across familiar faces. The executive who had first questioned Caleb cleared his throat. "You said your wife died in surgery," he said carefully. "Yes. And after that, you left medicine completely." "Yes." The executive leaned back slowly. "That must have been difficult." Caleb thought about the word, difficult. He remembered the sterile smell of operating rooms that suddenly felt unbearable, the echo of hospital alarms that reminded him of the night everything had changed, the tiny infant who had needed someone steady when the world suddenly wasn't. "Yes," he said simply. Lucinda watched the donors exchange quiet looks, because none of them were used to hearing sacrifice described without drama. Another board member spoke. "You could return to surgery," she suggested gently. "Your skill would save many lives." Caleb nodded once. "That's true, then why not?" He glanced toward the window again. From the boardroom's height, the city looked calm, cars moving like quiet streams of light through the streets below. Then he answered, "Because the life I'm responsible for now is already enough." The words landed softly, but they carried more weight than any speech that had ever been given in that room. Lucinda leaned forward slightly. "There's something else they should know," she said. Caleb looked at her. Lucinda addressed the board. Last night I said his daughter deserved a better future. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Lucinda continued calmly. I believed opportunity meant wealth, connections, private education. Her voice softened. But watching him save Jordan and then walk straight back to his child changed that perspective. She turned toward Caleb. You never tried to defend yourself when I said those things. He shrugged lightly. Didn't seem useful. Lucinda smiled faintly. That restraint probably taught this room more than any argument could. Across the table, one of the older Foundation trustees nodded slowly. I think many of us owe you an apology, the man said. Caleb shook his head. You don't, the trustee frowned. We judged you unfairly. Caleb leaned slightly against the chair beside him. You judged a job title, he replied. Not me. That sentence lingered. Because everyone in the room knew exactly how often they made that mistake. Lucinda studied him thoughtfully. There's one more thing, she said. The room turned back toward her. My foundation exists to help children who need stability and opportunity. Several board members nodded automatically. Lucinda gestured toward Caleb. But what we witnessed last night proves something important. She paused. Sometimes the best support a child can receive is simply protecting the parent who's already doing everything right. The room grew still again. Because that idea had never been part of their mission statements before. One donor spoke quietly. What are you suggesting? Lucinda's answer came without hesitation. I'm suggesting that the foundation begin programs supporting single parents directly. Several board members blinked. Scholarships for children had always been the focus. Supporting parents was different. Lucinda continued. Training grants, medical child care support, flexible assistance programs. The trustee who had apologized earlier nodded slowly. That would address the root problem. Yes, Lucinda said. Another board member looked at Caleb. Your story could inspire the change. Caleb raised an eyebrow slightly. I'm not much of a symbol. Lucinda smiled. You're not a symbol. She glanced around the table. You're proof. The donors fell silent again. Because for the first time since the meeting began, they weren't thinking about money. They were thinking about perspective. Lucinda stood slowly. I invited Caleb here today so everyone in this room could see something clearly. She gestured toward him. Real strength rarely announces itself. The board members watched the quiet father in work boots standing beside their polished table. Lucinda finished the thought. Sometimes it's the person quietly fixing the wiring who's holding everything together. A few people smiled. Others nodded thoughtfully. The meeting that was supposed to discuss quarterly funding had turned into something far more important. And as Caleb finally turned toward the door, several donors stood instinctively out of respect. Not for a title, not for wealth, but for the man who had reminded them what responsibility truly looked like. The boardroom slowly emptied after the meeting ended. Executives gathered their folders more quietly than they had arrived. Conversations moved in thoughtful murmurs instead of confident declarations. Several board members paused on their way out to shake Caleb's hand, something none of them would have imagined doing the night before. He accepted each handshake politely. Then he slipped out of the room without ceremony. The hallway outside felt calmer than the boardroom had been. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall hospital windows, warming the polished floor. Nurses moved past with charts and tablets, the ordinary rhythm of the hospital carrying on like nothing remarkable had happened. Caleb headed toward the elevator. He had promised someone he wouldn't be gone long. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, carrying him down through the hospital floors until the familiar pediatric wing appeared again. Bright murals lined the hallway. toy carts rolled past. Somewhere a child laughed. It felt like returning to the only place that really mattered. Mila spotted him immediately. "Daddy." She ran across the play area again, the same unstoppable energy she had shown the night before. This time she was holding a small paper crown made from folded hospital craft sheets. "You came back." "Of course I did." She placed the crown on his head carefully. "You're the king of fixing things now." He chuckled softly. "Is that official?" "Yes," she said with complete seriousness. A nurse nearby laughed. "You've got the promotion everyone in the building is talking about." Caleb removed the paper crown and placed it gently back on Mila's head instead. "I think she deserves it more." Lucinda approached from the hallway, smiling at the scene. "Jordan asked about you this morning," she said. "How's he doing?" "Annoying his nurses already." "That's a good sign." Lucinda nodded. Then she glanced toward the play corner, where Mila had returned to adjusting her crooked block castle. "I meant what I said earlier," she added. "About supporting parents." Caleb leaned against the wall. "That program could help a lot of families, that's the goal." Lucinda paused before continuing. "You also changed something else." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "My definition of success." The hallway hummed quietly around them. Machines beeped in steady rhythms. Children's voices echoed faintly through the wing. Lucinda gestured toward Mila. "I spent years thinking success meant building bigger programs." She looked back at him. "But sometimes success is simply showing up every day for the person who needs you most." Caleb followed her gaze. Mila had finished rebuilding her castle. This time it stood straighter, stronger. She waved again. "Daddy." "Look." He smiled. "Looks perfect." Lucinda exhaled softly. "I'm glad she has you. So am I." They stood there for a moment longer, watching the small world that mattered most. Then Caleb pushed away from the wall and walked toward the play corner again. Mila grabbed his hand immediately. "Come help me build the dragon tower," she said. He knelt beside her. Plastic blocks clicked together. A dinosaur guard returned to its post, and the quiet single dad who had once saved lives in distant operating rooms returned to the role that mattered far more to him now. Because titles fade, careers change. But the moments we show up for the people who love us, those are the ones that build the strongest foundations of all. If you've got another story title you want us to tackle next, tell me. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. The janitor they ignored locked the school doors, then the police discovered why. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?